And I too salute Mr. Capuano and his short sleeve shirts. I wanted to touch on two topics, as I think the last one here. No, Mr. Weber is joining us. The first, as someone who represents Connecticut, I have to drill down more on the Northeast Corridor and serious concerns. There's been way too much loss of life. There continue to be delays on that, and safety is paramount. And the other is I do want to, before the close of my 5 minutes, return to Mr. Hamburger's point about basically performance standards. And I think if we in America are going to have a transportation and infrastructure system that is state-of-the-art, we've got to figure out how to move much more nimbly. And I do want to return to that because we saw that with NextGen. We're seeing that with this, and we are losing ground around the world. And we've got to figure out together how to stop pointing fingers at who's responsible and saying we have to redo how we get to fast, safe, affordable. So on the Northeast Corridor, Mr. Naprostek, I know, not everybody in this room knows, but I know the Connecticut lines are owned by the MTA, not Amtrak. So when you say how much, when you're talking about how much of that, of the Northeast Corridor, that everything Amtrak owns is going to be compliant, what is not going to be compliant? So what lines are, what portions are not going to be compliant, and how heavily traveled are those portions? Because the rails are actually owned in Connecticut, or owned by Connecticut, are owned by the MTA. They're not owned by the state of Connecticut. Are those all going to be compliant with PTC?
I believe, let me get back to you with specifics on Connecticut. I actually have somebody on my staff who could easily answer that, but I believe they will be compliant. But I would want to verify that 100% in terms of Connecticut. If everywhere we run service in Connecticut should be compliant by 12/31/18.
All right, because I have to say, for many of us, this is like Groundhog Day. I've been on this committee for almost 6 years, and we've been hearing about we're close, just give us a little more time, And frankly, you know, I have to say the folks in my district are angry and worried and late to work, like a combination of all those. That's not a good combination. So you hear that frustration up here. That's because, and the chairman of the subcommittee has raised that, people have not come forward to say this is what we need, and to wait till the 11th hour. I mean, how is Mr. Batory supposed to go through on the 31st of December? This is like college, you know, paper being done all night and asking for an extension at, 1 minute of midnight. It's not any good way to instill confidence in the writing public. And it makes it impossible for us to do our jobs of oversight. And that's really for everyone. I mean, don't wait. Tell us what you need, and we will try to work with you. Mr. Batory, I agree with you on those fines. I mean, you get people's attention. People and the Class 1 freights have complied. But if people are not complying, you change the business calculation if you're facing a big fat fine. And we did do that extension in 2015 because we wanted the money to go to PTC, not to fines. And here we are 3 years later, and it didn't work. So I think people say, take out the sticks now, because this is not working. We haven't succeeded in getting this done. So again, what is it going to take to get this done as rapidly as possible? We're not going to performance standards 2.0. We better go to performance standards. What exactly do we need to do right now to get this done as fast as possible? Is it fines? I mean, Mr. Batory, do you think it's fines? And I'm on a fast response. Do you think it's fines to get attention now?
That is definitely a tool in the toolbox. And as I mentioned earlier, I would like not to have to use that tool, but if that's the one you have to use in combination with everything else that we've now invoked, okay, I think we should do nothing less than that insofar as exercising that. But the main thing is getting the concentrated, concise, collaborative communication, and I'm going to speak to the Northeast Corridor, from Boston down to Washington, D.C. When we met with those 41 railroads, Amtrak was one of them. And even though we've read in the newspapers, over the last 3-5 years, that the Northeast Corridor has PTC in place. It has pepper spots and stains all over it where there's no PTC. They have done an excellent job this year in trying to get rid of those pepper spots and stains where Amtrak is in total control of itself. The next thing that became very apparent, we had to maintain nothing less than a dialogue of once a month on a macro perspective with Amtrak. We maintain a dialogue with them daily, tactically, on PTC. But they host a lot of commuter railroads. So as a result, it then became apparent that we had an absence of synchronization between the commuter railroads and Amtrak. And the only way you're going to get that resolved is communication, and you can never have too much communication. So as a result, with our monthly meetings now, we have basically, we don't ask people to come to Washington, but we allocate whatever amount of time, it's usually about 15 to 20 minutes, for each individual commuter railroad to express on the monthly call where they see issues with Amtrak and where Amtrak sees issues with the commuter railroads, so we can get them in sync and get this PTC piece in place. It is a very densely operated piece of railroad that doesn't lend itself to absorbing a lot of variability because of its density, and we have to have this interoperability piece in place sooner rather than later.
May I add a perspective? I think one of the things that we need to think about is that only 8 railroads said they're going to make the December deadline. So 32 are seeking an extension. Of those 32, 12 would like to use substitute criteria, particularly initial testing, and that's in the really early stages. And our analysis has shown that from initial testing to RSD takes on average 2 years. So if you do the math, we're concerned that some railroads won't even make 2020.
As long as people are adding on, let me add on, if I might, Mr. Chairman. Those people who are filing for an alternative schedule, I would argue, are not filing for an extension. They are filing on an alternative schedule under the law as written. Several Class 1 railroads and Amtrak were ready to be declared fully implemented by the end of 2018. But the FRA regulations stipulated that no one could be fully implemented until everyone was fully implemented. Therefore, the host railroad, whether it was a freight railroad or Amtrak, could not asked, but was denied being declared fully implemented because their tenant railroads were not fully implemented. And I think Mr. Naparstek is being kind to one of his tenants by not going further down that path. But it is important, I think, for this committee, and as I read some of the media outlets, for the media to understand that there were railroads ready to be fully implemented, 100% operational, and were denied that and were forced to apply under the alternative schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. Final question, Mr. Weber.
If I could, I'm sorry, sir, but if I could answer Congresswoman Esty's original question. So for Amtrak tracks in Connecticut, we will be 100% in operation by 12/31. For CDOT, they will be PTC operable completely by the deadline, and Metro North will be filing for an alternative schedule.
Thank you. Mr. Weber, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Gosh, I don't know where to start.